I just asked if I could just borrow the card for a couple hours. Like, no, dude, I'll help you. Pretty grateful, yeah.
So hello everybody. So how many of you, and you have to excuse me, I have a voice this week which is far better than last week, but it squeaks and cracks like I'm an adolescent boy. But anyway, how many of you are from group D? And how many are from group B? And how many are randomly from other groups? Okay, why not? Excuse me. I have just had the crud. I'm Patricia Fingerhut, and I'm the chair of the Occupational Therapy Department. And I am using Matt Dashout's slides, and I actually saw him do this once, and he has all these great stories and everything on me. So I will give my best. But just quickly, I know most of you have name tags and everything like this, but just quickly, let's go around the room and just give me your name and your school.
Maria, I'm School of Medicine.
Leslie, Physical Therapy.
Justin, School of Medicine.
Spencer, School of Medicine.
Kirby,
Prithvi, School of Medicine.
Jessica, School of Medicine. Steve, School of Medicine.
Neil, School of Medicine.
Vienna, School of Medicine.
Gustavo, School of Medicine.
Tony, Life Sciences. Chelsea, School of Medicine.
Legal Life Sciences.
John, PT.
Sam, PT.
Megan, PT. Camry, OT.
Desiree, PT.
Valeria, School of Medicine.
Okay, so we got quite a variety here. So we've got School of Medicine, PT, OT, and CLS. Anything else? Did I miss? Okay, well that's great. So we're being a little interprofessional here. And I apologize for the cough, but I have the water. Today what we're going to talk about is, I think this might be your last topic, or maybe not. But we're going to talk about public health, epidemiology, and metrics. And basically we're going to talk about public health and the importance of public health for basically health care, health provision. So, first of all, your assignment was to look for a current article that applies to public health and your particular discipline. So did anybody have an interesting article that they would share? Pete.
I had one that I kind of just stumbled upon. It's kind of looking at public health, and it was having to do with like people forgiving people and forgiveness, and education on that. And it can actually like certain like mental health outcomes. But the fact that if you don't forgive people, it kind of just festers inside you, I guess, and it alters your mental health. So education on that aspect of things. I don't really remember because I spent it a long time ago.
This sounds kind of interesting. I'm writing a chapter on mental health right now. I might need that article. Anybody else?
I found one on scoliosis screening and how it's done in different settings, but it said there's a lot of evidence in the short term, but it was almost completely lacking any evidence for the long term of whether PTs have an effect on scoliosis in the long term change.
So it's basically that 12-year-old girl idiopathic scoliosis screen thing. How many of you, did they do it boys too? Everybody at 12, shoot down the spine, and they weren't doing it in my day. But so you were all tested for idiopathic. So that's a good example of a public health initiative. It costs money to have them look up every 12-year-old spine or whatever age it is, but does it actually prevent scoliosis in the long run? And your article wasn't necessarily, it was more related to whether PT, muscle strengthening, etc., prevented scoliosis.
I have a question. Was the conclusion that there was not enough data to make a conclusion?
Yeah, it was a systematic review, and so it pulled a lot of different data and said there's strong evidence in the short term that bracing and muscle strengthening had an impact. Whether those things were held over years there's just interesting.
It's interesting, but yeah, these people who are identified, and then they end up in those Boston braces or whatever they use these days. Obviously, I haven't done scoliosis in a while, and or strengthening activities, and they weren't sure whether it was truly effective. However, it's good public health initiative. And to my knowledge, they're still doing it. So somebody seems to think they have data that it's worthwhile. Any other articles
Since we're talking about public health, I read an article about leprosy and how 80% of all leprosy cases occur in India, which is where I'm from. And even though there are very effective treatments to treat leprosy and people can lead full and complete lives even if they're affected, the social stigma prevents treatment. So a lot of people live with leprosy even though they don't have to. And a lot of people are stigmatized even though they don't have leprosy anymore after resolution.
And so they're still quarantined?
Yeah, there are leper colonies
Uh-huh.
where all the people affected by leprosy are shipped off to.
And that's actually one of the slides that we have today, and a really good example of a public health response to a public health issue. And you bring up a good point that even though it's curable, we now know what causes leprosy, we know how to kill leprosy, et cetera, there are still people that, because of education in public health and lack of universal access, are still suffering from things that are totally curable. Okay, any other articles you?
I guess kind of, you said universal access. So for OT, kind of what I found was an article talking about a professor from Temple University who has been working on projects going into learning centers like museums or parks where children have learning opportunities and kind of making them more accessible for children with disabilities, also altering like the environment, the atmosphere, like lights and sounds, so that children with autism can engage in those learning experiences. So kind of like making educational experiences that should be available to everybody, available to certain populations and all populations, so universal access.
So that's, I mean, obviously people, I'm looking around and people look pretty young. So you don't remember before there were curb cuts and before there were disabled buttons to open doors in public places and things like that. But that was all a public health initiative. And this is taking that public health initiative even beyond. Not only do government public buildings have to be accessible, but now cultural events and things like that. There's actually an OT professor at our competition to the north who's doing a similar thing in Dallas. Okay.
Yeah, I have one more. So I looked up the whole public health surrounding tuberculosis and how they treated it. And in the past, they used to give a BCG vaccination, and they found out it wasn't very effective in treating it. And even it's still sometimes used in international countries, but the United States has stopped using it completely because the cases of reoccurrence in TB is pretty frequent. And also it talked about even the public health of people who were diagnosed with TB and were put on prophylaxis and medication, and how they went about not contaminating others and spreading others. And something that they do is they'll have people come to your house 3 days a week to check up on you and see if you're following through on your treatment and to counsel you and stuff. So it was a pretty extensive global health as well as public health initiative that's being taken place to.
Well, in TB, you're all familiar with the polio epidemic of the 50s, and the TB epidemic, actually, I lost a grandmother I never knew. She died at 32 of TB back in the early 1900s, and it was quite an epidemic. Now, in North America, we've not eradicated TB, but it's very rare, and so it does make sense that the whole public health initiative has to change. Now you all have to have TB tests every year. So to make sure that you don't have TB, but they're not expecting, it's not a vaccination thing, as you explained. They're not expecting people to have TB unless they've been in contact with somebody. Okay. So basically what we're going to talk about today is public health approach, why it's important, why it's really a very effective part of our health care. And when I was talking to the students last week, we were all sort of saying, not a whole lot of our curriculum, but health prevention, which is more where public health often is involved, has a huge impact for a smaller dollar. And then we're going to have videos of work this week, and we're going to have, and then we're going to do a case study at the end. Okay. As much as I practice, I can't say this. So, you're all familiar with Fernando, and he's from GHICC. Somebody else can do a better job. So he's from the sea country. And so Fernando is now entering elementary school. And you have met Fernando before, yes? And he is missing a lot of classes because he has a GI upper respiratory illness, which half my faculty have right now. And that is having an impact on his grades. And his mother works across town, and she takes one of these combis, this little bus and bus. So, how many of you have ridden in such a vehicle, a combi? Oh, quite a few of you. Anybody wish to comment on that experience?
Definitely not the most comfortable experience.
Not a comfortable, not comfortable, not safe?
Yeah, usually riding close to chickens and things too.
When I was in Guatemala, they call them chicken buses there. And I never was sure whether it was because they seemed to be playing chicken with every car that was on the road, or whether it was because of the fowl that were, I don't know. But, yeah, they're pretty terrifying and not exactly safe. And his father was diagnosed with diabetes and is having a hard time because of his diabetic neuropathy and all that thing in doing, I guess he's kind of handyman. And so he's having difficulty finding work. Okay, so now you're a little bit familiar with the sea country, and you realize that they have a different kind of infrastructure, different kind of economic status, etc., than the United States. So thinking about it, I'm going to try and break you up into groups. Let's say 5 groups, because I think some of my other things I have 5 questions. So that'd be about 5 of you. So self-group into 5 groups and just quickly come up with some ideas of how the government can have an impact on the population health. What kind of public health initiatives would really make a difference to the public health?
Oh, wait.
Jump in. Previous experience.
This is a new government.
So I'm just thinking, you can vaccinate your population, or you can educate them.
Education in general. If you're a government, you already have established the easiest, cheapest way to go with transport. Yeah, it's hard, especially for like bigger people, to probably support mass health projects. Like you have
Yeah, sanitation.
like clean up the river and like.
Even if it's not.
Something like something like you could.
So public service announcements, like
Closed captions.
Yeah, super sure. There's got to be something.
Between you, what
You guys are providing nursing care.
No, like a needs assessment.
Oh, and not all this practice, but it's also needs. It needs an issue. So there's someone who
Yeah,
learns
it's one thing you can do, it just depends on.
I went down here as
They
a, as
asked
like,
all around and
they
asked
do
us to
It's supposed to be pertaining to like
something's
the,
don't clear.
the situation.
It's not figured out.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a
So
board.
Colorado.
What they're trying to say. And that sort of stuff.
That's not our.
Oh, yeah, they can also do like,
If they do have.
that's pretty much writing in terms of things that are doing grading and not project, right? That's like an issue with a lot of people out there, just how screening people.
I only know that because I live in a place where they have Colorado. They vaccine.
And then you have to consider.
I think.
Into our water. It's about dental health. So there are certain steps that can be taken on that aspect.
So it's, you need like, it must be afterwards.
So how you guys doing? Everybody's got some ideas?
I mean,
Some like,
or maybe
a couple.
Okay,
So,
let me get a
I've never taken it.
marker
They
here.
just, I know they give it if there's a suspected outbreak.
And we'll start, randomly, we'll start in the back corner there. Give me one idea of something that could be a public health initiative funded by the government.
Well, we decided that needs assessment kind of to direct a more, I guess, specialized approach. Because we don't really know, like, if it's, we were saying if it's cholera or something, then maybe vaccinations would be our first priority, or
We'd like to know what major health issues are affecting our population before we
Right.
give like a very specific answer.
So you think
Or like
something
sewage
like a
control,
public
water.
health survey, kind of a needs
Yeah.
assessment?
Yeah,
Okay.
that needs assessment. And then also I think we had the suggestion of, vaccination campaigns, DHM.
Okay, so a needs assessment to make sure that you put your limited financial resources where it's necessary. And then you had another suggestion?
For a more specific thing that might be enactable. It said vaccine campaigns in
So there
general.
might be a vaccination campaign, especially against whatever seems to be the need. It's amazing I can spell better, I think. Okay, another group.
We talked about education and public transportation as well as vaccinations.
Say it a little bit louder.
Yeah, so we talked about like educating the population.
Okay, educating them about
Well,
lots of things.
yeah, like, you know, like
Chronic health conditions.
infectious disease.
Okay, so
Washing your
public
hands.
education campaigns. Education on prevention, and that could be chronic conditions,
Spread of infection.
infection control, all sorts of things like that. How about this group?
We had one that was, so it'd be like providing healthcare in school systems. Because they can, like a nurse, like a school nurse, or having someone out in
So
the
like a
settings.
primary healthcare in schools?
And then we did televised like public service announcements, PSAs.
So that would be your public education exams, and so you, prevention on that, and one of the things that you might use is a TV campaign. Now, I don't know enough about the sea country here, but do they have TVs? Probably. I mean, the vast majority of people, probably. My experience is that, they barely have power and water, but they have TVs. You have to admit, it's pretty cheap entertainment compared to going to the
Power and water
opera.
is the country's, is an infrastructure issue, but everybody has the ability provide their OT basis.
Yeah. So I hear you say infrastructure. What other kind of infrastructure might be really a public health issue?
As mentioned earlier, sewage, their waste disposal systems, their piping, what is piped into the house, is it lead-based pipes or old, where's the reservoir, their source of the water coming from?
Exactly. So infrastructure with water. What other kinds of infrastructure? I heard somebody else mention it.
Transportation.
Transportation. No more combi buses. Or at least combi buses that go on roads that don't have cliffs on one side and.
It's environmental controls, like what's in the air, like air pollution.
Environmental control. Environment. So basically that could fit under infrastructure too, in that you need waste disposal and you need air quality,
A reliable supply of electricity.
reliable power. Caught most of them. I have cheat notes. One more that's on here that's somebody addressed the primary health care in schools, but probably, screenings and basically availability of health care, period. So healthcare availability.
So like the healthcare infrastructure itself, like they could invest in universities that train doctors, where new students become doctors. There's research done at universities.
Education for healthcare providers. There's one more that they were mentioning. When you think of healthcare as basically being safe, what else do you need that's not always available in developing countries?
Pharmaceuticals are often not guaranteed that you're getting what you prescribed, or it's in any way, shape, or form what it needs to be, or if
So reliable. This is getting a little confusing. Yeah. Reliable medications and interventions. I mean, I'm sure that licensure is not exactly an issue for most people providing health care. So.
Conversion to like universal systems, so like disabilities, providing like accessibility to them.
Okay, so that in the infrastructure, universal accessibility. And the one that I never really thought about, and whatever too, is policing and safety. So not only road safety, but some kind of justice system, so that you don't get mugged. So some kind of policing. Okay, so all of these are part of what creates public health, and so these initiatives look quite far-flung and are somewhat removed from the day-to-day education you're all getting in conditions and incidence and prevalence and intervention strategies and evidence-based practice and all those other things that we drill down your throats every day. These are very widespread, but they truly do affect health. So these are a couple of definitions, but I want you to just give a little minute to think about what really is health. Who would like to define health? And the World Health Organization, only in the last 20 years completely changed its paradigm of what is health.
By their definition, no one is healthy.
by their definition, no one is healthy. Well, hey, I'm a walking, breathing, coughing example. Yeah, I mean, nobody has perfect health, but the concept of health, and basically what the World Health Organization, they went from a paradigm of absence of disease to quality of life type thing, and participation as opposed to disability.
Mind, body, soul. Like
Mind, body,
Maslow's
soul.
hierarchy of needs fulfills up to here, and then from there you go into the mind, and then the soul is spiritual.
So yeah, so health is a much larger concept, and it's not just as we previously described the absence of disease, but rather the quality of life, and as you say, both in a mental health state, a physical health state, a spiritual health state, true quality of life. Now, I can't help but think about like an occupational therapist, because I've been one for almost 40 years. We're all about participation. You know, if you can get her done and do exactly what you want to do with your life, and do it the way you want to do it, isn't that health? So again, that fits into a more current view of the World Health Organization, that being able to participate in what is important to you and do it is health. Okay, so public health. What do we do to make sure that people can get it done and do it the way they want to do it with satisfaction, do it in a way that's fulfilling for them? And this becomes a rather, as you kind of suggested, a rather subjective thing. Not all of us want to do the same things or have the same thoughts, and that becomes really, really important as healthcare providers, because we have to constantly be evaluating our clients, our patients, and looking at them, and what you may consider healthy may not be a quality of life for them. So you have to look at it from an individual point of view. Okay, so now we're going to see a video. And hopefully it's down here where I put it. Where are all the videos I put? It's not that one.
It's a ton of them.
There they are. Thank you.
Public health.
What do I think it means?
Good question.
I haven't a clue.
I think that's private health.
Hygiene?
Hygiene. Do that?
I don't know.
It's really funny about this. Everybody can see everybody doing things everywhere.
So people walk by and they be like, oh, this is public health. Everything around you is public health. The stickers will be like our voices constantly reminding people that this is public health, this is public health, this is public health.
By seeing these stickers, they'll see that we do a lot, and they'll see that they actually need public health to keep them healthy and to keep them well.
Hybrid buses in New York provide cleaner air for everybody.
Thank you.
If there's a bike rack, that means that more people are actually going to be riding their bikes instead of taking cars or taxis. Let's definitely figure that. Having a fresh fruit stand like this encourages people to include fruits and vegetables as a part of their daily diet. We're sticking it so people can see that this huge cigarette isn't good for them. The message is clear.
Water safety is a public health issue because if we don't protect our drinking water, then it can trickle down into the food that we serve.
It really helps people to pay a lot more attention to their nutrition and to the things they're putting in their bodies. Public health right there.
Community health vans are a public health intervention at a community level, making sure that the aging population not only has access to certain services, but has transportation to get there.
My definition of public health relates to the environment.
Public safety.
Eating well.
Free clinics.
Sewers.
Washing your hands.
It's teaching safe sex.
For AIDS awareness.
Most important because of public issues.
The air quality. Truth in labeling.
I think it has to do with your eating habits.
Educating the public about ways to improve their health and happiness.
Helping people with cancer.
Being on constant monitor of your own body.
Taking care of the citizens of our city.
Public health is about controlling the factors that you can't control that control your health. You're only as healthy as the world around you. Public health is your health.
Today we're going to explore the question, what is public health? I get asked this question about once a week. What is public health? What do you mean by public health? Now, if you look up a definition of public health, if you look it up online or look it up in a dictionary, you're going to get something that's
Sorry, bye. Make you go away. Okay. So obviously, as the video shows, public health, and somebody might want to turn the light on again because it is late at night and everybody's going to go to sleep. So it's everything about keeping our community strong, which trickles down to keeping us strong and healthy. And so, interestingly enough, we want to talk about some of the public health initiatives and how we all benefit from them. And the thing is that we've sort of mentioned before is that public health initiatives have a really good bang for your buck. Basically, promoting healthy living is a lot more cost effective and has a better outcomes and leads to better quality of life than treating illness after it occurs. So these are some of the things that you suggested that are out there that create public health and safe communities and opportunities to have quality of life. This is sort of the bang for the buck thing. Studies have shown that for each 10% increase in local public health spending, infant deaths have gone down 6.9%, cardiovascular deaths, diabetes deaths, cancer deaths, and then seatbelt use is amazing. Now, none of you ever remember riding in a car before seatbelts, but believe it or not, seatbelts didn't come around until the 60s, early 70s, and they certainly weren't mandatory. And you basically, if you had an older car, you didn't have to put them in. Do you remember no seatbelts?
Yeah, one of the first cars to ever have a seatbelt was back in the 1930s, and they didn't sell them because the manufacturer believed if they released a car that had seatbelts in it, the population would perceive the car as unsafe because you had to be strapped into the seat.
Well, it does make sense.
It was actually a down. It wasn't a
It was a
bus,
down.
It was a
So
down.
I never heard that, but I like that story. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but obviously I was around in the 60s and 70s. And now I remember many people, mentioning no names, my father-in-law, who no way they were wearing seatbelts. It was the craziest thing the government was trying to impose upon them. Why? Not being able to jump out of your car when you're about to have a crash would just be a death-defying act, etc. Now, you'd be hard-pressed to find a public member who would say, oh yeah, you're much safer without a seatbelt. But at that point, it was a really tough sell. It cost a lot in public advertisement. Also, you look at cigarette smoking, and thank goodness we all live on a campus that has no smoking on campus. All of you have seen people smoke and know that there is a lot more smoking in other parts of the world. There's been a huge public campaign too. I was telling the students last week, I had my first child in 1985. Some of you are going, that's older than me. But in 1985, and my children were all born in Canada, in 1985, my son was born. You were only allowed to smoke at the end of the hall on the maternity ward. So there would be all of these ladies puffing at the end of the hall with their little IV tubes and their bassinets with their newborns. And if you happen to be like me in the four-bed ward at the end of the hall, you could barely see the person beside you because of the smoke. My next child was born a year and a half later. I know I had 3 and 3 years. What was I thinking? But the next one was born a year and a half later, and you could only smoke in a very small room on the labor and delivery floor. I guess it was for the nervous fathers or whatever, but there was this little room. And my third child was born in 1988, and there was no smoking in the building. And when I first started practicing, I went to school in the 70s, and when I would go to school in the 70s, this hospital, I mean, we're not talking the general population, we're talking the healthcare providers. The hospital cafeteria was blue with smoke. And it was healthcare providers in there smoking. And now you would be, well, now we live on a campus with no smoking. So it's huge. It was a huge public campaign.
I mean, and even recently, when I went to college in 2007, I went to college in St. Louis, and there was just a room in the St. Louis airport where you could smoke. And it was not like quarantined off, it was just kind of behind a glass wall, but I mean, you could smoke in the airport in 2007.
In 2007.
So, like, we've come a long way in 11 years. So
Well,
it's been a massive change quickly.
it has been. And for anybody who's traveled in Europe lately, I mean, you used to know, I'm in Europe now. You get off the plane and you go, whoa, take my last clean breath. Well, last time I got off a plane in Europe, it's sort of like, whoa, they moved it outside. You know, it's progress. Oh, heck, in the 60s and 70s, you smoked on airplanes.
Yeah, I was about to say that.
Yeah. So, and so, yeah, then they got to the point where you only smoked at the front of the plane, or was it the back? Didn't matter. They just circulated the air. But anyway.
And it wasn't because it was a public health crisis, because planes crashed, because people will put their cigarettes out in the bathroom, in the trash can, and will cause a fire.
Cause a fire, etc. But, yeah, huge thing. So, again, public health initiatives have an incredible bang for your buck. Now, we have other public health issues right now, like obesity and all those other kinds of things. We haven't solved all problems, but I'm very impressed with the reduction in smoking. Okay, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and to quote Dr. Dashow, that is why Ben is on the $100 bill, because he is quoted of saying that. Okay, so now we've sort of talked about what public health is and what initiatives can be done to reduce or to promote public health. Now I want you to go back into your little groups again. I'm going to give each group a different metric. And so what I want you to sort of change your thinking now is think, okay, so we have all these ideas of public health and how we can influence the communities around us by public health initiatives. How do we measure? What kind of metrics do we use to measure whether a population is healthy or not? Okay, so this is your metric. So I'm going to give you 5 different metrics, and I want your groups to kind of read them and discuss them a little bit, and then present your metric to the rest of the people, and evaluate your metric as to what it does measure and what it doesn't measure. Okay, so be discriminative here and think about, what is your metric good for, and what kind of information does it give, but does it give the whole picture? What's it missing?
Should I go ahead and read it? Okay. probability expressed as a rate per 1,000 live births of a child born in a specific year or period dying before reaching the age of 1 is subject to age-specific mortality rates of that period. Numerator is deaths aged between 0 to 11 months, and the denominator is the number of surviving children at the beginning of specified age range in the 10 years prior to survey. Method of estimation data is derived from the reanalysis of DHS microdata, which are publicly available using the standard indicator definitions published by the documentation. The analysis was done by the International Center of Analysis and Monitoring Equity in Health and Nutrition in the Federal University of Public Health. So, I have no idea what I just read, but we can figure it out. Oh, no wonder. I was like reading the first word. I thought this was like all regarding probability. And so, yeah, that makes 60% now. It doesn't really talk about the quality of life after the first 11 months. It's just like how many survived up to that point.
More information on these.
So it's like the point you're born on.
When your metric.
Well, it's up until 11 months of age. So like between the age of 0 to 11 months, if you die either at birth or up to the age of 11 months, then that's part of the infant mortality. But like, say you died at 12 months, or say you died at like a year or 2, like that's after that point, then it's not part of that number.
Just to make sure that you're right, things will get left out.
No. Oh, really? You were
age
What are the metrics that are not counted by? Things are pretty good.
Let's take a chunk of your population, not even the entire population, focus down on specific elements. Now this has
so it's every year. So every year is like how much of the population is living past 11 months of age. Like if you die before 11 months, you're part of the year without it past that year.
You know, but this is only
so it's kind of like showing like how good care like the mother has.
This is also into military service. When they get shipped off into an area that is not a good position, and a lot of them are not there this way. So now you have a death metric that says much of your population is fair.
I guess this is better than that.
Your life is 24, 19, and 21. You're automatically cutting your population average down to like, oh, your average life expectancy of this area is, I wouldn't say that's your time. So there's definitely some draw. A lot of it on top of the fact that it's like, especially a countrywide survey, it's not even important.
But I guess like to explain the metric, I think we understand its and then what's left out is like pretty much like the quality of life after that point.
What is the
So has everybody got a pretty good idea of what their metric measures? Yeah, you guys ready to present? Okay. How about we present? So let's. I'm gonna put you people with the Dallies at the end because you got the hardest job. Which group's the Dally people?
Dally.
So, okay, I'm gonna make you last. So, infant mortality, explain to us your metric.
Oh, okay. So infant mortality is like essentially explaining the probability that you'll make it to 11 months of age. And if you don't make it to 11 months of age, you're part of the overall population of people that die.
The metric of infant mortality. So what does that tell you about a population? If you compare, if you're trying to compare us here in the U.S. and people in Congo, and you're using the metric of infant mortality, what's it telling you about the two places?
Well, it's going to tell you about how good the nutrition is of the population, like is the mother getting folates and prenatal supplements for the child, and then like it's going to also show the quality of life or the quality of care that the child receives after birth, so like the infrastructure of the hospital, like how like clean it is and the procedures that they're taking to make sure the child is like vaccinated. And
so it's a pretty good metric of sort of like, is there health care available, and is the water clean, and enough things that babies can be born and live to 11 months. So it does measure that metric. Okay, what about life expectancy? Who has that one? Okay, what's life expectancy?
So life expectancy is basically the average kind of death age of the population. It takes into account the age at which each individual dies from specific data that they're receiving from like surveys and censuses, and then kind of averages out the data.
Okay, so if they make it past 11 months, now we're trying to predict how long they're going to live. So what kind of information does that metric give you?
So it can give you the quality of life somewhat. I think there's a lot of drawbacks to it as well. You have different diversities in different areas that could affect your life expectancy. You have wartime versus peacetime nations, which can affect it.
Very good.
I don't think it's a horribly good metric.
Very good point, because you could have exceptionally good air quality and food and everything else, but you could live in a land of natural disasters or wars or whatever that would artificially change that life expectancy. And you mentioned quality of life. Living is not necessarily what we described as health. So it doesn't tell you whether you're living the life you dream of, living life to the fullest. Throwing a little catchword there. If you're living life to the fullest, or whether you're living. Okay, so it's a metric. It measures things, but it leaves some things to be science. Okay, who's got the prevalence incidence? What does that measure?
Prevalence is the number of people affected divided by the total number of people in the population.
Affected by certain conditions. So,
right.
What's
a
the prevalence
exposure to a risk for having a disease. And we felt that the weakness of this measurement was that it requires a lot of other demographic information to interpret it. If you don't know the age of the people who are affected or the sex of the people who are affected, then it really doesn't mean much to just have a number that says 5% of the people are affected. So what? There's no actionable...
that's a good point.
Yeah, there's no way to have an action unless you know who is affected and how they're affected.
Yeah, so, coronary heart disease or whatever, if it's prevalence of a certain percentage of coronary heart disease, but it's all in the population beyond 80 years old, that's different than if the incidence is every year there are diagnoses of more and more young people, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a metric to measure, whether we can keep them alive to 11 months and how long we can keep them alive, and how many conditions these people get. So again, measuring two countries. What is the prevalence of multiple sclerosis in this country and that country? What about quality adjusted life years? Who's got that?
Well, we got two.
Oh, you got the quality and the, so what did you guys get? Oh, incidence prevalence, 1, 2. So what, did I miss a group?
4 groups. We have 4 groups.
Oh, we only have 4 groups, so you took 2. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so
We skipped that one.
You just did the disability adjusted life years. Okay.
So disability adjusted life years basically takes two measures into account. So you get the years of lost life. So they're like, okay, this person died young. This is the years of lost life. But then it also takes into account the years lost due to disability. So they put a measure onto years lost due to disability. And then they put that into a daily, and it corresponds to the deaths multiplied by the standard of life expectancy at an age at which the death occurs. So it does take into account, like, if a 4-year-old dies or is disabled, that is a different weight than, say, if an 80-year-old dies and is disabled. And then they put that all together to calculate the daily. And although it seems to be better than the other people's matrix, it still doesn't quantify health. It really just is saying that overall this population is living longer and being disabled. So that would be kind of like maybe a third or first world thing. You could compare that, but it doesn't necessarily say you could be a disabled person who still lives a high quality, healthy life, or you could be somebody who lives a very long time but doesn't have a great quality life. And you don't consider, or mental health, it doesn't even take into account mental health for any of those.
So yeah, you described that very well because it's a little complicated. But again, as we spoke of before, health is somewhat of a subjective term. And an example I used last week, and now it was so long ago I saw the commercial I may have forgotten, but the Olympics are coming, in case you didn't know. The Winter Olympics are coming, and the Canadians only watch the Winter Olympics. But I'm American now too, so I have two teams to cheer for. But there was a commercial I saw on TV the other day about a young man who had lost his legs to amputations. And he was very depressed and all those kinds of things. And I think it may have been in battle. And however, somebody talked him into playing sled hockey, which is like they sit on a little sled and they play hockey, whatever. And he won a gold medal playing sled hockey, and now he's all excited because he's going to the Paralympics again, and he wants to win another gold medal. And so I'm thinking of your Dally statistic. Would he be considered disabled at 20, or is he now living the dream?
I was about to say, if I lived next to the National Ability Center in Park City, and if you wanted to get down a mountain or do something outdoors, blind, you name it, you would get down the mountain.
Yeah.
They will adapt, modify, get down. And the Paralympics, a lot of the training is done there. We have a huge Paralympic team, and some of those people are so impressive, and trust me, they feel that they are living a full, thriving, and healthy life.
They don't consider themselves disabled. Exactly. I used to teach disabled ski, and I had everything from children who are blind, adults who are hearing impaired. That's a whole other story. Anyway, people with cerebral palsy and amputations. So,
double amputees above the knee have summited Mount Everest, so they can pretty much do anything that move.
They're less disabled than me. You're not going to find me on Mount Everest. It just sounds like an awful lot of work. Okay. So now we're going to sort of move on from the metrics. So we sort of got the idea of what is health, what is public health, what are public health initiatives, and how do we measure it? And obviously you need a lot of different metrics to really be able to say whether the population is healthy or not. So now we're going to go into a little history background. So the medical professions, all the healthcare providers, they didn't start out with the scientific evidence-based practice that you're all got today, and a generation from now they will be even more evidence-based. They will look at some of the things that we do now for interventions, and they will giggle and sneer. But back in Hippocrates' time, which we all talk about as the founder of medicine, what was his sort of title? Yeah. They really had very little knowledge of what was going on, but they tried to explain the phenomena they saw, which is what scientific people always do. So they came up with this idea that there were sort of 4 humors, and the And if your humors weren't in alignment or your humors weren't balanced, then that's what made you not healthy. And so their interventions were designed to rebalance the humors. So what were some of the common things you think they used to do back then to balance humors? Bloodletting was a big one. Just use leeches and yeah, all those kinds of things, so if you weren't vomiting or bleeding, you weren't really balancing your humors. However, now I was saying last week actually that I doubt any of their clients ever came back for a second intervention, so who's to say they didn't cure them?
You can still do the kind of India, Ayurvedic clinics.
Sorry?
In India, the Ayurvedic clinics, that is what they still do. Yeah, like it's based off of your 3 doshas and your imbalances, and they have 5 ways of detoxing. And it's purging, bloodletting, enemas, fasting.
Oh wow!
It's actually the basis of that. Ayurvedic medicine is older. It's the oldest form of medicine, and it's still practiced
in certain areas.
The southern part of India.
I don't practice it.
Oh yeah, it's really expensive to go to an Ayurvedic clinic in the States. It's the basis of yoga too.
Okay. And it's well, and there's probably a lot of interesting practices right here in the U.S. as well. So now variolation. This is now. I just want to make sure I've got this right here. So the variolation was one of the precursors of vaccination and some of the public health stuff that we have now. And what happened was these Chinese healers, and again, these were very clever people. They observed their environment and took scientific data and tried to figure out the phenomena. And so what they noticed was smallpox, of course, was wiping out vast populations across the world. And they noticed in the 1500s that people got smallpox, but some got far milder cases than the others of this condition. So they figured that if they took the pustules of the people who had the milder cases and they dried it into a powder and they blew it into the nostrils of other people, that they would get a less severe case. And in actual fact, it had some effect, and that was sort of a precursor of vaccination. Okay, and this is when they, I think, okay, yeah, so then this is when they started, the humor started to fade, and they started to think that the diseases, et cetera, were caused by what was in the air, what was in the environment, and they called that the miasma theory. And actually, that one lasted a very long time, till the beginning of, the 1800s, 19th century, where they really felt, and, there's people who still sort of, there is some truth to that, because obviously we have so many airborne conditions. But because populations in certain areas would get cholera or smallpox or something like that, that they were sure that what it was bad air and miasma in the air. Okay, and then in the late 1600s, this guy von Leeuwenhoek, which you probably all remember from your 7th grade history classes, he actually was a draper. He made draperies for furniture or for houses, etc. And he wanted to take a better look at the fibers and line them up more beautifully, etc. So he started monkeying around with prisms and lenses and stuff like that. And he developed the first sort of a microscope. And they say that he actually got to a 200 to 500 resolution. And while he was checking out his fancy fibers, he kind of noticed a whole bunch of other things. And so it says here he is credited with discovering bacteria, spermatozoa, muscle fibers, and many more animalcules. I've never heard the term animalcules before, but So he discovered all these things under the microscope, which led to the whole theory that maybe there's more out there than the naked eye can see. However, obviously, just because you start discovering these things, we don't have Twitter accounts and stuff, so it doesn't go out to the whole world. So it takes hundreds of years, actually, for some of these theories to evolve. And then, of course, there was many sort of snake oils and this and that and all sorts of kinds of things that people tried, and faith healing and all the kinds of things people developed over the years. And then we got into the actual vaccination. And most of you are probably very familiar with the story of the milk maidens and the milk pox, and how, again, smallpox was still eradicating large populations. And what they noticed was that the ladies who did the milking, the milkmaids, had terrible eruptions and sores all over them. So it wasn't like they were not infected, but they were infected with milkpox, and they never got smallpox. So they came up with this idea, of course, that they would take the pustules and they would grind them up and they would inject them into somebody to inoculate them against the smallpox. Now, the part of this story that I find absolutely amazing, because there was obviously no IRBs in those days, is that the British Edward Jenner, the guy who did this, talked his gardener into letting him inject this into his 8-year-old child. And then, after he'd done this, he talked the gardener into then letting him inject smallpox into the 8-year-old. And sure enough, the 8-year-old did not get smallpox because they had the milkpox. So thank goodness it worked. But anyway. Yeah, no, some poor 8-year-old kid. And it also says that, and vaca being a cow in Spanish, and that's where vaccination came from, with the cowpox. And then the polio epidemic in the 1950s. The vaccination, the first one was the Salk vaccination, which is the injection, right? And the Sabin vaccination is the oral, right? So anyway, that's just kind of a little bit of history and where we came up with some of these preventative health things. And this is a great video of one of those people who was observant and figured out what was causing things. Oh, this is it. Hello. Yeah, this is it. It's just we had this nice commercial.
$1,000 or finance for $20 or less per month, interest free. It's amazing. 100 rooms under $1,000 now at Rooms to Go.
We'll do a little furniture shopping first.
London in the 1850s is a marvelous jewel of a city. It's also 2.5 million people crammed in a small city with no infrastructure. You had no big sewage system at that point. You had no waste management systems. So think about what would happen if you had a disease like cholera, which requires sewage and clean water mixed together.
The bacteria moves from the human body, but it can only survive if it gets into the water supply and it's transmitted through feces making contact with water. In London, you have a situation where if no one knows why this disease is spreading.
In 1854, when there was this outbreak around the Broad Street pump, within a week or so, over 500 people died. 3/4 of the community had fled, and so this was a very severe outbreak.
Cholera was this plague that ravaged through Western society that everyone ran from.
Jon Snow was a risk taker. He was willing to put his life and his career at risk by going into places where there was cholera.
Jon Snow was one of the first epidemiologists, and what he decided to do was, using the scientific method, try to figure out what was causing cholera in the communities.
Jon Snow begins to construct a map, and he finds that the disease tracked with the map of the water supply of the city, such that areas that were supplied with similar sources of water were being affected, and the neighboring area, which didn't have the same source of water, were not being affected. You could track back this map, and the map looks like a star, and the star has a center, and the center is typically, was in his case, typically a water well or a common water supply source. And thereby, he began to figure out that it must have been the water supply source that was causing this epidemic.
Look, it's so rich, it's making people sick.
Jon Snow convinced the local Board of Health to take the handle off the Broad Street pump and then bring that outbreak to a halt. And we continue to use all of these epidemiologic methods today.
By piecing together those clues of a detective, using information and science, he changed the course of infectious disease in the Western world.
Cool dude.
Is there anybody else who's a Game of Thrones fan in here that got excited about it?
Yeah, Jon Snow's one of the characters in the game. Not the same guy.
You're so fan.
They're both real pictures, you know?
Yeah.
One of my kids made me watch that show.
And you loved it.
I kind of went,
Yeah, I don't get it, but it's good.
yeah, no, I can imagine it would be addicting.
Season 7 was disappointing, but that's
A lot of shows can be a little bit addictive. Thank you, Patrice. Okay, so case studies. Are we down to case studies already? Oh yeah. Okay, so what we're going to talk about now is some public health disasters, some public health successes. And this is a contrast of the, we're contrasting the country of Haiti and the Panama Canal. And so what happened, as you can say, and most of you probably know the history of Haiti, also the island of Hispaniola, it's Dominican Republic and Haiti, and I believe Dr. Dasha's in the Dominican right now. So, but Haiti is the poorest country, I believe, in the Western Hemisphere. And Haiti has a very sad history. It was populated by runaway slaves, so they were people who had nothing to start with, were constantly fearing for, recapture. They had no infrastructure, etc. So they had to kind of build a country by its bootstraps. What happened was then the Spanish arrived, and the native population that had lived there were completely wiped out with smallpox. So what you have is people who have been imported not by choice to this country. The people who considered it their land and had the generations of understanding of how the land worked and had great pride in it were completely wiped out. And you can imagine that there was sort of nobody protecting it. It was people who were just fighting for survival. So there was no people who could feel like this was their country and resist bad things coming in. So it basically became the main port for the slave trade because there was sort of nobody protecting the country. There was no infrastructure or people who sort of had ownership in that place and resisted bad things coming in. And to this day, that country is still recovering. Now, they've had a whole lot of natural disasters and other things to not help them on their way. But it's very difficult when you don't have the basic infrastructure to protect a place. Panama Canal makes the Americans look very good. Obviously, in order to get from the west side of North America to the east side of North America, you had to sail around the bottom of Argentina there. What's that called?
Cape Horn.
Cape Horn, thank you. I've got Cape of Good Hope, that's Africa, right? Cape Horn. You had to sail around Cape Horn. It took months and months to go from the west to the east. And somebody got this great idea that right in the very center was a very skinny piece of land in Panama. And if we could just scoop it out, then we could scoot through there. So they decided to make the Panama Canal. And the French began the construction in 1880. And it's not that they weren't good at scooping or that they didn't have a good plan to build the canal or anything else, but they couldn't import workers as fast as the workers died. They were dying of malaria because of the yellow fever and the mosquito population. So they eventually gave up because, like I said, they couldn't import enough workers. They were dying too fast. So in 1904, the U.S. took over construction, and they started with a public health initiative. First thing they did was drain the swamp. It sounds very political. And they issued mosquito netting to everybody, and they sprayed chemicals, and they got rid of the mosquitoes before they started, and they diverted the water from stagnant water, and before they started construction, and they managed in 10 years to build the Panama Canal. So, okay, that's much what I wanted.
I have an interesting story about quinine.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you know how we all like gin and tonic? So gin and tonics were started by the British Raj in India as prophylaxis for malaria because tonic water has quinine in it.
I didn't know that. I don't particularly like gin and tonic, but my husband does, so I shall tell him that story.
So that's why it's like Bombay Dry, gin.
Really? Oh, that's a very interesting. How many lives were saved by? Oh, I can't walk and chew gum. Sorry. How many lives were saved by gin and tonic?
So many.
It's been called one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. A man-made waterway, 50 miles long, that forever altered the face of the earth.
The Panama Canal exceeded any country's capacity. If in 1904 you asked me to put money, I would have said, no, it cannot be built. Nobody knew how this was going to be done.
The geographic location of Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, has always been coveted as a way of making the oceans meet. With the building of the Panama Canal, the realization of a dream became an expression of the power, the strength, the might of a growing nation.
For nearly 100 years, the Panama Canal has stood for the triumph of technology over nature. But when it was built at the dawn of the 20th century, it was simply an audacious gamble, a colossal engineering project, the likes of which the world had never seen.
It's a story of inspiration. It's a story of humanity. What man can endure with a pick and shovel to dig the canal.
It used science and engineering and government to improve the country and really improve the world. But it has a dark side as well. It is also a symbol of arrogance, authority, and power.
The canal really announced the United States as the leading country in the world. It demonstrated an extraordinary will and determination. They had succeeded in conquering nature as no one had ever done before.
So that doesn't have a whole lot to do with public health. My stories had more, but it does show the Panama Canal. Okay, so this is some of the things that we talked about how they actually managed to control the mosquito population and the yellow fever that was killing all the workers, and how they were able to build the Panama Canal. We talked a little bit earlier about leprosy and quarantine. How many of you participated in What's Wrong with Warren? Okay. One of the things with What's Wrong with Warren, I was one of the people who originally invented Warren and decided we must chop off a few fingers and a few other things in order so that everybody could participate. But one of the things we wanted to do is to make sure that the the School of Public Health would have a place to discuss with Warren too. And so, if you remember correctly, he was the second case that had happened in Wall High, etc. Because I learned at that time that that's what triggers the CDC to actually get involved, is you have to have at least 2 cases. So one of the large public health initiatives that they used to have was quarantine. And in this case, with a case like Warren, it is the CDC that determines whether there needs to be quarantine, whether people need to be separated, etc. And these are pictures from long ago. On the right is a leprosy colony where people were quarantined basically for life with leprosy. And on the left, I think, maybe it says in these notes, but I think it's tuberculosis.
Was tuberculosis the disease for which they used the iron lung?
Yes, because they.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Yeah.
You're right, because they're paralysis of the diaphragmatic muscles. Yeah. No, tuberculosis. They had sanatoriums. That's what they did. They had TB sanatoriums. So people went and were quarantined there. Well, it's hard to say, but that's probably what this is people with TB. It could be any kind of condition, unlike it's before the time of polio. Okay, so today we talk a lot about tropical diseases and public health, and some of the international health structure designed was initially to deal with some of these tropical or infectious diseases, and to obviously when the Spaniards came to North America, they brought their diseases, and then they contracted the malaria and the diseases of the area, and neither population was immune. Okay, so they eventually started having scientific conferences to deal with all of these things, and these are some of the international groups that were developed. And of course, you're probably all pretty much familiar with the fact that here at UTMB we have the National Lab, and we have some of the most renowned tropical disease and infectious disease researchers in the U.S. Okay, we also talked a little bit about public health campaigns, and these are some of the more graphic public campaigns that were established and were very, very effective. Obviously, she may be a bag of trouble, and I take one everywhere I take my penis, were obviously from the time of the Second World War. and spitting. And believe it or not, people used to spit on the sidewalk all the time, chewing tobacco and things like that. Okay, so we're going to kind of finish up with talking about what are the core functions of public health initiatives and basically assessment. And I think you folks identified that early on, and that you need to do a needs assessment to find out what is required. You have to develop a policy, and then you have to be able to measure to see whether it's actually working, and some sort of policies that assure that people are actually following them. So that's why we have police systems and the CDC for quarantine and things like that. So we're going to finish up with this little outbreak case. Excuse me.
It's actually very hard to imagine that there are people in the second decade of the 21st century that are living under these conditions. One of the other things you'd notice as you walk around in Canberra is that the people that are there are almost always smiling. They're within the moment and accepting the condition that they're in and doing the best they can to live well within those conditions.
In Kibera, I think I'm okay because I'm getting my day-to-day bread, so I'm fine.
Kibera is the largest continuous slum in Africa, and we have somewhere between 600,000 and 1.2 million people living in basically a river of informal huts and structures. We have a very unique project going on in Kibera. The point of the work is to understand what diseases are causing the most problems for the people living in this environment. And so the way we do this is we have a group of what we call community interviewers. They're basically field workers. Most of them actually come from Kibera. They're residents of Kibera.
We have a total of 25 field staff who go around into the villages collecting also mobility surveillance.
And they carry personal digital assistants, PDAs. And these PDAs are programmed with the questions that we're trying to get answers for.
Like, we can talk with cholera. H1N1 was found in the community through the community interviewers visiting the houses, the questionnaires they asked. Can I come to our house every week? She wanted to know how we are going on. Anybody who has been sick, anybody who has been in hospital, 2 weeks, maybe.
And we're about to go into a home where one of our community interviewers will be collecting data about illnesses in the home.
So in this last 1 week, what was data you continue to do?
This is an area of about 30,000 people, about 8,000 households. They go to every single household every 2 weeks. And they collect information about who's sick in the household and what kind of illness they have. And if someone's very sick, they encourage them to go to the field clinic. It's right smack in the middle of the surveillance area. And so everyone in our surveillance area, the 30,000 people that we do surveillance on, lives within, no more than a kilometer, much closer to this clinic.
Like when they felt sick with pneumonia, couldn't work. I couldn't do anything, so my neighbors carried me up to CDC.
When they go to that clinic, if they have a condition that we're surveying for, that we're concerned about, let's say it's pneumonia as an example, then we collect information about that illness in the clinic by one of the well-trained clinicians that we have working there.
We have identified quite a number of bugs. Initially, diseases like flu were not considered to affect third world countries, especially in Africa.
And now we're preparing over the next couple of months to introduce influenza vaccine in the population that we're working in. The way we conduct our surveillance we can extrapolate to much larger populations and therefore influence policy that is not just limited to the population that we're doing the work in. Being able to identify that we have huge incidence rates of typhoid fever, for instance, enables us to go back to the ministry and say, if you use typhoid vaccine in similar environments, you can prevent a certain number of these severe infections per year at a certain cost. It's clear that, like it or not, we live in a global village these days, and because of market practices, because of air traffic, it's very possible for disease to move from one corner of the earth to another within a day. And so diseases that emerge, for instance, in the urban slum of Kenya that might seem so remote and not relevant to someone living in North America are actually quite relevant and quite important. There is progress that will be made, and we have tools now that we can bring to bear that will make a difference. It is somewhat helpful to know that there are people, there are organizations, there are governments that are willing to focus on those problems.
There's nothing that motivates me much as seeing somebody or a child who was sick getting back on its feet again. They are positive, especially the women and children, because they know what they're getting from CDC.
We're just going to back up one slide and just kind of look. So from the video that you just saw, kind of look at the wheel again, the Wheel of Fortune here, and try and so identify some of the things you saw in the video and where they fit in the wheel.
Surveying is the investigate.
They did.
Monitor health.
Okay, so an assessment, they did the survey and they monitored the health, and they determined that there was a lot of, what was it? They were typhoid. That there was a lot of typhoid, etc.
They basically developed policy for typhoid and vaccine and providing vaccines to that population and then exporting that, saying it would work for other populations.
Exactly. So then they developed a policy and they mobilized the community. I thought it was very interesting that the healthcare collectors, the data collectors, that were from the community. So they were actually employing people, not bringing in UTMB students from. And they developed a policy, and then they had to have built the medical center because there had to be some resources for these people to actually go to. And obviously there's a lot of steps missed out here somewhere along the line. They have to develop a relationship and get the people to trust them and believe in this health clinic and feel that the health clinic was there for the good of the community, et cetera, et cetera. And then that would be the link to provide the care, and then they would provide the vaccinations, et cetera. And then back to the data collectors again. They would be evaluating to see what the incidence now of typhoid would be. Okay, so the last activity we're going to do today is, are you going to be 5 groups or 4 groups? Because I have 5 questions. So I will just pass these out, and I want you to look at this. And in light of the video that you just saw, take a few minutes to answer the question, and then we'll record that.
Every one of my friends
Then
has
we
like
will
told me how to beat a case for
call
my
it a
phone.
night.
It's broken their phone.
Sorry.
If this is an outbreak due to verified increased.
Sorry, guys. I didn't give you the case. I mean, hey, there's something missing here. Okay, so basically, yeah, this is what you're answering the questions about. It's an outbreak. Back in Fernando's. Okay, so Fernando's neighbors have been stricken with an acute, severe diarrheal disease. They're profoundly dehydrated to the point of obtundation. Okay, somebody in the School of Medicine, tell me what that is. Okay, they're severely dehydrated, okay? So they all sound pretty bad. And have needed to be promptly referred to the regional hospital for treatment. Word from relatives returning from there is that they have been diagnosed with cholera. But this has not been confirmed. Word is getting around that the water is poisoned. So the clinic facilities are being swarmed with villagers worried about getting sick. Concerned about water contamination from the factory, community leaders decide to alert the local authorities. At the request of the federal government, PAHO sends a representative from the main office to the village to help investigate the illness. She recommends a quarantine of all factory workers and that until more is known that people from the village not travel. Okay, so now you can answer your questions. Sorry.
Especially if it's true. Yeah, it's actually cholera.
Dr. Fingers. Can you leave it on the last slide?
Yes, sorry, that would make sense.
So, all the papers were out, and is yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. There's vaccination.
And you figure it out.
Well, yeah, it comes from feces.
I'm just going off what she said.
It's like, yeah, COVID DDO all sketchy on here. At least the micro stuff. It's awesome. It's like this thing that we use to study microbiology. It's like a bunch of videos with like animations. Each one is like a new topic. It helps to read it. But yeah, I guess in this case, like, they should start with that. Make sure so you can get that's just a prophylactic, right? It's for very severe cases.
Well, and there's things that water.
Yeah.
That's how they treat
Got it. Maybe like some sort of like
it's just
but who is in charge now?
yeah, there's a new thing proper certification. That would set just one person. And they like clean the water. It's not really. I'm sure if you go small scale version, it'd be like yeah, you boil it. Yeah, before you get water. Yeah, that's really all you have to do. You just have to tell people and spend some money and educate them. But yeah, you're right. I don't think they can clean it like a swimming pool and put chlorine in it. Actually, cholera has to do with like increased chloride channels.
So 1 more minute.
cities, but I think
But yeah, I think like
You definitely go small, like in a third world country.
right, or the country itself is not much like this, but the rest of the world.
And then there's just like sanitation. So, like, don't.
Okay, so should we gather back together and we'll go around and we'll start over here with you folks. And so tell us what your question was, and then tell us what you discussed.
So our question was, does this event fit the definition of an outbreak? What are possible explanations if it does fit the definition? So we said it does. It was happened very quickly. People were panicked. They needed to be isolated. So there was more than one person. And then we read their explanations. It's possibly from the water. And they don't really know much more yet.
Okay.
Pretty straightforward.
And next group.
So our question was, how would the average person react to being quarantined? And we pretty much agreed that it would be negative. We would not like it. And I don't know how many people have been through like an airport where they're doing temperature screening, and if you fail it, then they put you in another line, and you have to sit there for the rest of the day. Thought about how that happened to me once. I did not. I was just like crossing my fingers, like, please let me get through, because I want to catch my next flight, even if I am sick. So, yeah, thank you.
It's kind of a me first, but we also said like in like the average person probably wouldn't, but someone who's like seriously affected, like someone who's debilitated by the illness would probably kind of appreciate them because it means they are actually getting health care. So that is kind of what I'm saying.
Well, that is a positive way of looking at it. Yeah, you are actually, if you're being recognized in quarantine, then you're actually receiving some health care. Because it would make a huge difference too if you were being quarantined for 3 days. I would say, oh great, do I get to watch Netflix? And or if you were, as you discussed, being quarantined to some island with the other people with leprosy for the rest of your life.
Also, quarantine doesn't always mean treatment. Right. Like during the Ebola outbreak, they were quarantining people, but like in places that
But
had no
hopefully
palliative
the
care.
factory is in relation to our case.
I don't know.
They're just like, this factory's off limits.
We
It's
have a
like the
bad track
Chernobyl
record.
of factories.
We like to quarantine people, but we don't necessarily do care.
That is a good point. In this case, you start going with the quarantine. We've been identified. Now we're going to get care. But I guess there's no necessarily cause and effect on that. You could just be identified and quarantined, and then they all run away. Okay. Next group.
We had what human rights issues does quarantine raise, and we're kind of going along more those lines, especially because it just arbitrarily said the factory. Well, not everybody can be sick in the factory, and if it is cholera, if they weren't sick, they're about to be sick, unless they're providing them with bottled water. And are they providing them with bottled water? Are they providing them with food? Are they separating families? Are they creating a family now dynamic where maybe a child's not being taken care of that was supposed to be taken care of because parents are now quarantined? How long does the quarantine last? Who's responsible for policing? Like you look at some of the issues we had in the U.S. with like the Superdome and Katrina, with people staying there, and there was lots of, there was nobody providing security for a group of people. We've stuck everybody in a factory. Is there anybody making sure they're safe?
It's a great
Kind of going off of that, in this case, a quarantine would be counterproductive. If they have cholera and they're getting infected by the water and people want to leave, let them leave because they'll get to water sources that are not contaminated.
But then they would spread it to contaminated water sources.
Yeah, because they would then have diarrhea in other areas, so that's why they're not having anybody.
Nailed it.
That's
Yeah.
great. I
You're
didn't know
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean,
But good point. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that these people that are pushing for a quarantine, like the community leaders, they're probably not fully sure how it's spread. They're probably just it's from the factory and we need to quarantine these people. But it's not you can't be in a room with someone who has cholera and they breathe into you and you get cholera. It's not like TB, or it's not spread that easily. It's it's fecal to oral. Like, you have to like poop somewhere, and it has to get in the water source, and someone else has to drink it. Like, you could also like reduce that measure not by quarantining, but just like having facilities where people aren't like, where the feces isn't getting into the water.
And it has to be contaminated a lot. You need like 10 to the 8th organisms or something to get cholera.
I think cholera is actually highly contagious.
It's very contagious.
Well,
It's like a little bit.
It just depends on the species. Vibrio, like the Vibrio species, the one that Colonosticus, it's highly contagious, where cholera is not as contagious. So it depends on which species of Vibrio. The one that causes cholera is not as contagious as like.
Remember the kernel is like drinking lemon water, acid like
Yeah.
bio.
You just see it though, and I think that's because the lack of the sewage.
Because they don't have a sewage system. Right. Their sewage goes into their water system,
And then it gets
But
contaminated.
in this case though, isn't that he lives in a very
Would we not
poorly
assume,
industrialized area? No, go ahead.
I would say, would we not assume, since we have known cases of cholera, that they were exposed to a high enough dose of whatever the
Well, we're
organism?
suspecting cholera. And, I mean, rice watery stools, yes, but there are so many things that cause digestive issues. And it's if somebody actually like, oh, rice watery stools, so you're just suspecting cholera, which is self-limiting, doesn't require treatments. But if it's something else, like a lot of the Vibrios or E. coli or Klebsiella, those viruses cause very similar effects in Salmonella, Shigella, you name it. They all have a varying degree.
So it goes back to that initial question of, is this an outbreak?
Yeah.
Does it meet the criteria for an outbreak? And so, yes, it does meet the criteria for an outbreak, but again, you have to determine what it is. And you all bring up really good points. Anyone who does not have it at this point is now being quarantined with the people who do. You're condemning them to it. And then, as someone brought up, the other point of who's going to go in and help these people and clean up the water and fix those kinds of things. So the effects of quarantine. Now, I think there were 2 more questions or 1 more question. Who has not? So
Yeah, we haven't gotten any.
your question?
Ours was something about the policing, who's policing this. And we just kind of said that we're kind of working from the ground up, like a ladder of management. So you're going to be having, I guess the federal government is the one initiating this protocol. So then you're going to have like your local or community authorities kind of doing a lot of more of the personal, close contact, face-to-face insurance that the quarantine is respected, whether it's, surveillance at airports or various modes of transportation. And then just kind of they'll have people who are supervising them, and then all the way up to the federal government.
So it really does take quite a large infrastructure to implement a quarantine. Who's going to keep these villagers from leaving? And, and who's going to make the people who say, I'm not sick, I'm not staying in the factory, stay in the factory, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me. And you folks.
So we had, if this is an outbreak due to verified increased risk and not an artifact of reporting, how should it be handled? So you kind of really need to do 2 things. One is treat the people that have already been infected by the disease, and then 2 is prevent the people who haven't been infected from getting it. So treatment for cholera is like mostly supportive, like it's IV fluids, but also like you can use the strong prophylaxis like doxycycline. So I guess you need some kind of infrastructure, like some kind of funding from the government to make sure that the people that are infected can be treated.
And then it's preventing it spreading.
Yeah.
By making sure that the water is not further contaminated. And they had a point in there about, or an artifact of reporting. So what do they mean by an artifact
I don't know, like
of
if it's
reporting?
just like if it's a bad game of telephone and it's just like word of mouth that it is cholera, but it's not cholera, right? So you have to make sure that it
Or it
is.
could be one of the other many diseases that you all talked about, GI insults, etc. However, probably in many of those cases, the public health program would be the same. Any diarrheal disease, you're probably going run into the same problem. You have to prevent that contaminating future people, et cetera, whether it's cholera or not. Yes.
Yeah, and you can also just like boil the water before you drink it too, right? Like, I mean, of course, like you eventually do want to fix the water supply, but you have to start small scale, and so you can just educate people to boil the water before they drink it, and that'll kill all the microorganisms.
I mean, I think the underlying thing is that a huge part of this is education rather than, punishment, which I think it can come off as it's punishing people who seem like they have no connection to a disease, but I think the public health response should be heavy on the educating people against spread, prevention is working out secure, basically. So, and also open dialogue can stem hysteria. So if you're clear and you explain to the community what needs to be done and what's in people's best interest to limit the potential of outbreak, that might be more effective than just roping off a building and being like, you're now quarantined,
And
stay
you're
put.
quarantined.
Like, you're going to have a lot of resistance to that.
Now, cholera is not something we've dealt with, but Ebola, when we had, was it last year or the year before? Life's getting way on me. When was the Ebola outbreak?
2014.
2014, it was that long ago. Okay. And then but I don't know how many of you experienced or had any contact with people with the hysteria of the fact that there were cases in Texas.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and Dallas wasn't Dallas the area of outbreak, and the absolute panic, even with the mass communications that we have today.
I know that they were monitoring the flights that came in from certain, because I was flying from Africa at that time, and I wasn't in one of the Asian countries, but and they were like, you could have been on a plane. So they were monitoring everybody who was coming into the States on certain flights. You had to sign some verification or some waiver as you were both entering the country. And
So you've not been in a...
but you had, and then if you were in Africa, you had to provide, because it was like a documentation of, this is the country I visited, this is the flights I was on, and this is where I went. So if somebody on my plane or flight had gotten it, then it would have been like down.
That's right, then they would contact you.
Yeah, traceable. Yeah.
Which is a huge public response.
You look at like a country like Nigeria that did have a couple cases, but their public health response was so robust and so thorough and was kind of, I would say, maybe not better than ours. We didn't really have much of a health response because we didn't have many cases, but
yeah, they were much closer to the epicenter.
They were, but I mean, they did have a couple outbreaks, but and we're talking about a country that has a quarter of the entire population of the continent of Africa, but they were able to manage their public health response in a way that focused on education, contact tracing, and really got to the root of who had been in contact with these people who had verifiable cases of Ebola, and they stemmed their outbreak. It didn't spread beyond, I think there were like 12 cases, and that was it. I mean, it was really
That's an impressive public health initiative.
It was extremely effective, but we don't necessarily. I mean, they had a really good plan, and they enacted it very successfully. So it could have been bad, but we should look at examples like that and kind of see what they did right and learn from that.
Yeah, that's an exciting one. Maybe I'll suggest to Dr. Dasha that he take that example and incorporate this into the public health lecture for next year. Because it is pretty exciting, and the fact that we're not all talking about Ebola 3 years later, unless you're in a public health or a global health class. Obviously has some benefits of the public health system. So that's really all that was planned to talk about today. So I'm hoping that you kind of gave you an opportunity to think about public health and what it means and what the initiatives are and how they tie into healthcare and your profession and how it is impacted on a broader on a broader spectrum. Anything else anybody wishes to add? Wonderful. Safe home, folks.
Where are you from in Canada?
Oh, I'm from Alberta.
Alberta.
Born and raised in Edmonton.
Okay.
Are
My
you?
boyfriend is from Canada, so.
Where? What part?
Toronto.
Oh, he's from the east.
Yeah, the other side.
Yeah, a month from now, I'm going to be in the Rockies at one of my nephew's weddings.
Oh, very good.
Yes.
I'm from Idaho, which is like right underneath.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you're from near me.
Thank you.
Who was the car manufacturer?
Actually, no, it was an American dealer. He independent, actually. And he was stomped out by.
I guess so. I don't know. We're the last group, I think. I don't think there's a RV, is there? So I don't know if they really need it back, but.
No,
Done.
that was the company that
I shall clean up.
but it was his own board that stopped production.
Yeah, for like 2000.
Because it was unsafe. Ford was the company that outpriced them. He eventually bought